When historians describe the year 1871 in Chicago, they usually focus on the devastation above ground, the Great Fire that consumed the city, the 300 lives lost, the 100,000 left homeless, the 3 square miles reduced to ash and rubble. But the real story, the one that barely appeared in newspapers, the one that even today sits buried in archival footnotes, began below the surface. It started with a simple rebuilding order. Engineers were instructed to clear debris across the burnt district, stabilize foundations, and determine whether the ground could support a new city rising from the ashes. The goal was practical: remove the wreckage, inspect the soil, and prepare for reconstruction. But the moment workers began digging through the charred remains, something unexpected happened. They broke through into tunnels that hadn't been accessed in living memory. Beneath the basement floors, deeper than any known construction reached, the crews found passageways and stations that didn't match any building records. Their alignment was too precise, their scale too ambitious, and the infrastructure didn't resemble anything in the engineering catalogues of the era. It didn't even resemble the primitive horse-car lines that served the city above. This wasn't mentioned in the public reports about reconstruction. It didn't make it into the newspapers celebrating Chicago's resilience. But in the internal notes of that year, a quiet phrase appears over and over again: unforeseen tunnels, unexpected stations, origin unknown. The official story would later simplify all of this into old utility passages, abandoned sewer projects, or simply natural limestone caverns. Nothing unusual, nothing worth discussion. But the recovery photographs from the time, the ones developed in dim offices while Chicago rebuilt itself in record speed, show something different. They show workers standing beside platform edges, cut with precision, far cleaner than any stonework of the era should allow. Tunnels bored so uniformly that even in the poor lighting of 1871 photography, the engineering is unmistakable. Track beds and guide systems that don't resemble any known transportation method, but something older, more sophisticated, more deliberate. And the deeper they explored, the more the passages stopped looking like utility infrastructure as we know it, and more like a transit network that had been built, operated, and deliberately buried. At first, the recovery teams tried to categorize everything in the simplest way possible: old drainage tunnels, abandoned freight passages, natural caves shaped by underground rivers. But as notes accumulated and more stations were uncovered, the inconsistencies multiplied. Why were some of the platforms built with dimensions that matched no known vehicle of any era? Why were certain tunnels shaped with aerodynamic profiles as if designed for high-speed travel? Why did some lines extend for miles beyond any documented construction project? And the question that troubled even the most experienced engineers: why was this system so impossibly advanced? Chicago in 1871 had horse-drawn streetcars on the surface, yet the transit infrastructure beneath parts of the burnt district appeared designed for something far faster, far more efficient, far more sophisticated than anything the 19th century possessed. Recovery teams quietly admitted among themselves that the engineering and scale didn't line up with any known builder. And although none of them were using terms like lost technology, they were acknowledging something just as unsettling. Someone had built a mass transit system here before. Not primitive tunnels, not simple passages, a network. As the documentation increased, so did the silence. Reports became shorter, descriptions became vague, photographs stopped showing the full extent of the stations. And then the excavation zones were partially filled again in late 1871, covered where needed for new foundations, and much of what was exposed was returned to darkness. Only fragments remain. Notes, a handful of photographs, and the quiet testimonies of archivists who saw the files before some of them disappeared. But even from what survives, a pattern becomes visible. Stations too sophisticated for any known era. Engineering too precise for the accepted timeline. Construction methods that look inherited rather than invented. Infrastructure that seems to belong to a different civilization entirely. And this is where modern researchers begin asking questions. that the 1871 teams could barely articulate? Was Chicago built above a forgotten transit network? Were later engineers repurposing infrastructure they didn't fully understand? And why did so many parts of the recovery remain undocumented, sealed, or simply erased from the records? Before we go deeper into these discoveries, before we analyze the stations, the tunnels, the propulsion systems, and the deeper engineering anomalies, if you're interested in these kinds of investigations, make sure you're subscribed. It helps support the research and lets me continue these long-form deep dives. Thank you. Now, as we move into the next section, we'll look directly at what the 1871 recovery teams uncovered. Not interpretations, not speculation, but the actual infrastructure. The precision-cut platforms, the unexplained tunnel profiles, the power distribution networks buried deeper than any known construction required, and the systems that look like they once moved passengers far more efficiently than anything we built for another century. When the recovery teams moved past the first recognizable layers beneath the burnt district, the expectations were simple. They believed they would find basements, perhaps some old utility lines, and scattered remnants from pre-fire construction. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary. But within weeks, that assumption collapsed, because instead of a neat sequence of basement levels, the teams uncovered a stack of infrastructure layers that didn't behave the way a normal city's underground is supposed to behave. The first anomaly was systematization. Each tunnel section, whether found beneath the commercial district, the warehouse zones, or the residential areas, seemed to follow the same design standards, the same dimensional specifications, the same engineering logic. Different areas shouldn't do that. Different builders, different purposes, different decades. They don't build in perfect standardization across an entire city. Yet beneath Chicago, they did. Tunnel profiles from one neighborhood matched exactly with tunnels found miles away. Platforms lined up with platforms in entirely different districts. Track gauges shared the same specifications, even when separated by what appeared to be generations of construction above. It was as if every component was part of an original system, one that no longer existed in any engineering record. As the workers explored deeper, the infrastructure became stranger. Beneath the expected basements and foundations, they began encountering construction that looked nothing like contemporary engineering. Much larger tunnels, much more precise boring, profiles that seemed aerodynamically optimized for high-speed travel. Some stations appeared almost futuristic. Platform edges with safety barriers, crafted with precision that didn't match the crude construction methods of any known era. And then came the discovery that puzzled even the most conservative members of the engineering teams. Electromagnetic components, not simple iron or copper as commonly used, but precisely wound coils integrated into the track beds. Magnetic assemblies with alignment systems, infrastructure that only makes sense for electric or magnetic propulsion. Yet there is no historical record of Chicago ever having electrical transit before the fire. No documents showing magnetic railways or powered systems at this level of sophistication. Nothing that explains why large sections of the deepest tunnels look like they were designed for propulsion technology that wouldn't officially exist for decades. Recovery photographs taken in 1871 show this clearly. Workers standing beside platform edges so precisely cut that the men look primitive in comparison. Tunnel walls bored so uniformly that even today, transit engineers study the archival images in disbelief. Curves and grades that resemble modern subway construction, far more than anything 19th century America is credited with. But the most unsettling detail was not what appeared in the photographs. It was what didn't appear in the archives. The official reports, written in the months after the fire, barely mention these features. Some drawings omit the station chambers entirely. Certain tunnel sections are summarized with vague terms like old passages or earlier excavations. Even though the photographs show they were far more complex than that, the silence is hard to miss. Because if these deeper discoveries truly belong to known historical periods, why weren't they described in detail? Why weren't the unusual propulsion systems documented thoroughly? Why were the photographs scattered across private collections instead of gathered into a single municipal report? Even some of the track components raised a red flag. Rails too precise, switches too sophisticated, junctions too complex, mechanisms that looked less like 19th century ironwork and more like precision engineering. Engineering that, according to the conventional timeline, didn't exist when those tracks were supposedly laid. The deeper the teams explored, the harder it became to fit these findings into the clean, linear narrative of Chicago's past. Because tunnel by tunnel, the ground beneath the city began to look less like utility infrastructure and more like a buried transportation network, a system built, operated, and buried at some point before recorded history, yet somehow remaining intact beneath structures that everyone assumed were built on virgin ground. And this brings us to the most important turning point in the entire recovery operation. A discovery that didn't fit any period. Infrastructure that didn't match American engineering, didn't match European design, didn't match any known civilization tied to the 19th century. Something out of place, something out of time. Because what the workers uncovered next were stations and mechanical systems that historians still struggle to categorize. Technology that seems to belong to an era we don't acknowledge. Infrastructure that raises the question no one wanted to ask. What exactly was Chicago built on top of? When the recovery teams pushed deeper into the ground beneath the burnt district, the discoveries stopped resembling anything that belonged to a clean and orderly engineering timeline. What they began uncovering were systems that didn't match American construction, didn't match European transit design, and didn't even match each other in any conventional sense. Instead, they formed a strange technological language, one that seemed to come from a unified source, yet somehow predated everything in the historical record. The first shock came with the station chambers. These weren't crude tunnels or narrow utility passages. They were geometrically perfect spaces, platforms shaped with exact dimensions, archways that held their curve flawlessly, and infrastructure laid out with coherence. Almost like the remnants of a master terminal that no longer exists in any archive. Some stations were sealed completely, packed with fill so dense that workers thought they had hit bedrock. But once opened, they revealed interiors that looked untouched since the day they were closed. Smooth walls, fitted tile, and equipment that raised more questions than answers. And then came the feature that still puzzles researchers today, the departure boards. Officially, they were later labelled as old signage or decorative stonework. But nothing about them fits typical 19th century construction. These were too uniform, too precisely carved, and too systematically positioned, as if they were designed to display information to waiting passengers. Some boards were large enough to be read from across the platform. Others contained mounting points that suggested mechanical or illuminated displays. Workers from 1871 described them in private letters as schedule markers, not decoration, but information systems with a transit purpose, though no one could say what vehicles they once announced. Another anomaly appeared in the ventilation systems. These were not simply air shafts cut through rock. Many were shaped with aerodynamic profiles, positioned at intervals that made perfect sense for atmospheric management in a high-traffic underground system. They were engineered as environmental controls, built for passenger comfort at volumes far beyond what 1871 Chicago could have generated. It created an uncomfortable possibility. The buildings above ground may not simply rest on old foundations. They may sit on something much larger, a transit network whose capacity was never recorded, never taught, and never explained in the official history of the city. The deeper the workers explored, the stranger the findings became. Platform edges appeared with perfectly uniform safety markings. Some surfaces were tiled with materials that 19th century chemists couldn't identify. Others showed wear patterns consistent with heavy foot traffic over extended periods. But the discovery that caused the most confusion was the power distribution infrastructure. Some conduits contained materials that metallurgists of 1871 couldn't analyze. Others showed configurations that only make sense for electrical transmission at voltages far beyond anything the era could generate. The official explanation offered later, old gas lines, mineral deposits, but that does not. Explain why these conduits appear in systematic grids beneath the platforms. Distributed, networked, designed to power something. That kind of infrastructure requires planning far beyond 19th century capability, far beyond anything recorded in American engineering history. Soon after these discoveries, something unusual began happening. Stations were filled again. Tunnels were blocked. Deep sections of the network were cut off from further exploration. Some of this was officially labeled as safety concerns, necessary to support new construction above. But the decisions about which stations to fill first and which tunnels to seal permanently raised quiet questions among observers. Because the spaces that were closed immediately were always the ones that contained the most anomalous technology: the electromagnetic components, the information displays, the power distribution systems, the ventilation networks that extended far beyond the excavation zone. These connecting tunnels were perhaps the most mysterious find of all. They weren't random passages. They were part of an organized pattern, a grid of routes that looked less like utility access and more like a metropolitan transit system. Aligned, standardized, planned. As if Chicago was merely built on top of a transportation network that existed long before. And yet, almost as soon as they were uncovered, many were sealed again. Their entrances blocked, their purpose unexplored, their existence quietly removed from subsequent city surveys. When you study the final weeks of the 1871 recovery operation, something becomes impossible to ignore. The exploration didn't end. It was stopped. Not completed, not concluded, stopped. The deeper the recovery teams went, the more the tone of their notes changed. Early entries were confident, almost routine. But by the end, the language becomes cautious, vague, and strangely incomplete, as if someone else suddenly controlled what could be written down. And this is where the final mystery begins. Because the last stations they opened beneath Chicago weren't ordinary. They weren't basements. They weren't utility spaces. They weren't even identifiable as any known type of construction. They were something else entirely. Multiple reports, the few that survived, described infrastructure that suddenly shifted from the familiar to the unexplainable. Platform edges with tolerances so precise you couldn't fit paper between the tiles. Tunnel curves calculated with accuracy that 19th century America was never supposed to have. Stations built to handle passenger volumes far greater than any surface building. And lines that extended beyond the excavation zone, disappearing into darkness beneath modern Chicago. But here's the part that always gets buried. The most advanced stations were the facilities that were filled the fastest. Workers described burying entire platforms, collapsing tunnel entrances, packing earth into spaces that had just been uncovered. It wasn't gradual, it was immediate. The official explanation: structural concerns, safety requirements, construction deadlines. But if it was only about safety, why were the most solidly constructed, most precisely engineered stations the facilities buried first? And why were obviously unstable areas left accessible for the new construction? It doesn't make sense unless those deeper discoveries posed a different kind of threat. Not a physical one, a historical one. Because if the infrastructure beneath Chicago truly showed transit engineering far beyond 19th century capability, and if some of those stations didn't match any known civilization at all, then the entire accepted story of American and world technological development begins to collapse. Imagine what it would mean if a modern city was built on top of something far older, something sophisticated, something engineered, something we didn't build. Imagine what it means if the foundations weren't just basements, but the stations of a transit system that predates recorded history. And maybe that is why the 1871 discoveries were quietly reburied, not to protect the sites, but to protect the narrative. The surviving photographs tell their own story. Workers standing on platforms that look almost modern, tunnel profiles that resemble contemporary subway systems, infrastructure too sophisticated for its supposed age. These aren't the kinds of discoveries historians like to explain. They're the kinds they prefer not to talk about at all, And that brings us to the final question of this documentary. A question no archive, no textbook, no official publication has ever answered fully. Why was the most advanced evidence, the most sophisticated infrastructure, the most anomalous technology sealed away again? Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clear. The precision stations were buried. The electromagnetic components were buried. The power systems were buried. The ventilation networks were buried. The information displays were buried. And even parts of the photographic record vanished, almost as if the recovery operation had accidentally revealed a chapter of history that wasn't supposed to surface. A chapter older than the Great Fire, older than the city we know, older than the narrative we were given. And for one brief moment in 1871, the earth opened just enough to show it. But instead of studying it, they closed it again, sealed it, filled it, forgot it, or pretended to. Because if Chicago stands on top of a transit network built by a civilization we no longer acknowledge, then the real question is not what was discovered in 1871. It's what else lies beneath the cities of the world. What other fires? What other disasters? What other convenient destructions cleared the surface just long enough for someone to bury what was below? The 1871 transit system wasn't just forgotten infrastructure from an earlier era. It was a glimpse, a brief accidental glimpse, into a version of history we were never meant to see. And now that glimpse is your clue, your map, your invitation to question everything we think we know about how our world was really built. Because if this is what survived under one city, imagine what still runs in the darkness beneath the rest. Something out of place, something out of time. This concludes the documentary, but our search goes on.